Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Salesforce Ben LinkedIn Live. This time we are teaming up with Elements.cloud as well as Salesforce to talk about mastering flow architecture. So I think architecture in the Salesforce ecosystem really has started coming up in most conversations in the past kind of 8 years or something like that. As soon as people realized that to scale Salesforce, you really needed to understand the architecture of each individual's part of the Salesforce system to ensure it could scale. And now with the rise of flow, it puts a huge power in the hands of declarative admins as well as developers to build very, very powerful automations that are similar to what you can build in Apex. But with great power comes great responsibility. And this is why today we're going to be talking about flow architecture, which is a topic I've never really heard discussed before. So I think it's going to be very, very interesting and very relevant. So I'm going to bring in Xavery from Elements.cloud. Hey, Xavery. And Tom from Salesforce. How's it going, guys?
Really good.
Really good. Excited to be here.
Good to have you here. Well, I will hand over to you guys now and let you take it away. And just as a reminder to everyone, we're going to have a Q&A at the end. So feel free to ask questions throughout the session. We'll catch them in the chat and try and get to as many as we can at the end. So take it away, guys.
Awesome.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. Here we are again, Tom.
Yeah, it's great to see you again.
Yes. Well, for everyone watching, let's quickly go through what we will be covering today. We'll start with the obvious elephant in the room. What is actually flow architecture? Why isn't anyone doing it? Or why isn't it necessarily so mainstream as me and Tom would like? What's the cost of not doing it? And then we will try to give you our agreed upon 7 best tips to get started and well, get really good at it. Anything missing, Tom?
No, I think that's pretty good. I'm looking forward to this discussion because I think, like we've already been saying for the first few minutes here, it's not a topic that gets discussed as often as it probably should. So this is going to be really great.
All righty. Well, let's get right to it. Well, that's us.
Yeah.
So, Tom, we spent some time talking about it yesterday. What is flow architecture, and what's different about flow architecture from just building flows? What does that term mean?
And I think that the way to think about it, it's similar to the way that you think about when you're designing a house, right? You've got your architect that goes together, puts all the blueprints and thinks about what is the best approach and what kind of materials should we be using here versus here, and why would we build the structure this way versus the actual carpenters and plumbers and everybody else that goes in and builds the house afterwards. And so those two roles have different problems to solve. So from the builder's perspective, you're thinking about things like, well, let's make sure we're not hard coding IDs in our flow and some of those tasks that that your flow isn't going to work right in a different environment if you don't build it that way. Versus architecture where you're taking a step back and thinking, number one, what type of automation should we even be using? Like, is flow even the right automation type to start with? And then, how does it fit within the rest of our org as we think about what is the business process supposed to look like? Where does flow actually fit in it? And then there's all the different patterns, like should I be thinking about synchronous or asynchronous and so forth? And we'd love to get your thoughts on that too.
I think you've captured it perfectly. I would maybe put it in a more slightly more infantilized way, which is it's like the architecture is about, if we're going to add a new automation, are we going to make the Jenga tower, which is our Salesforce org, fall, or are we actually going to make it more sturdy and kind of stable as a result? But you've captured beautifully. I don't think there's much.
I like the Jenga tower analogy though, because you're right. If you put the wrong piece in the wrong spot, it could have a lot of downstream effects that you may not have been intending. So that is one of the problems that architecture attempts to solve upfront as early as possible, so that if you do identify anything that potentially is going to knock the tower down, you're correcting it kind of in that early stage design phase before you get to the point where you start building something and then it becomes a lot more expensive to correct.
I think we'll cover this in more detail when we get to our tips. But I think when we had this conversation yesterday, you made also a good point that designing your automation with intent, because there seems to be sometimes almost an instinctive reaction to build the type of automation you're most familiar with or the most comfortable with.
Right.
That's not doing proper flow architecture, is it?
Right. Yes. Saying we're going to build a flow because I've built a lot of flows before and I know how to build a good flow doesn't necessarily mean flow is the right fit for whatever it is that you're trying to automate. And there is a decision guide. I think we even mention it later that is available on the Salesforce Architects website that talks about different scenarios where flow is a good fit and some other scenarios where actually Apex might be a better fit. So definitely worth checking out.
So when we are talking, Tom, about flow architecture, I mean the automation architecture in Salesforce context, we spend some time also discussing why is it that it's not being done as often, as consistently, as recurrently across most organizations as you think it should be done. And you had some ideas and rationale for why that might be the case. Would you mind going through it one more time?
Yeah, I think there's a few reasons why. Really, one of it is actually the history of flow. When you really think about what flows looked like, 5-6 years ago, back when you could design some pretty simple screens and update a few records, but it was really limited with what you could do. And the task of building a flow was kind of handed over to admins who could build a really simple screen flow. They didn't really have to put a lot of thought into what was going on, and you didn't need to. I don't want to say you didn't have to put a lot of thought into it. It's not the right, but it was more of you didn't have to think about it and have that like developer mindset that you need today. As we've continued to add more and more capabilities to flow, and now there's a lot of overlap. If you think of a Venn diagram with flow and Apex, and the two circles used to be pretty far apart of what you can do with one versus the other, and they keep getting closer and closer together. And designing a flow is a lot more like like building an Apex class now than it ever has been. But the problem is because of the way that evolution happened, there's never really been a clear set of a clear role that's been responsible for building flows within an organization. So some organizations have admins keep doing it, and some admins enjoy that, some don't. Some organizations will expect developers to do it, but if I'm a developer, maybe it's easier for me to read code than to design a flow. So it's.
I remember when you mentioned this yesterday, that I kind of it surprised me for a moment, but then it actually made a lot of sense. Could you expand on that? Why, as a developer, it might be you might prefer Apex as opposed to Flow?
Yeah, if I think about it, and I can tell you, I have a background from years and years ago where I was a .NET developer, and if somebody put like a class in front of me, I could debug that pretty easily because I had been writing code for years. I know how to go through the code and look and figure out what it's doing almost instinctively. Versus if I have a flow and I've got this big canvas and it has all these different elements and I have to click on the elements to see what they're actually doing and what data they're pulling. And then there's variables that are kind of stored off into the left-hand column. And, and for me, it's not going to be as instinctive to be able to figure it out. And it's going to take longer to trace through that versus, here's a set of code that I can, that I can probably read through in practically my sleep. So.
And I would like to also pick up on the third point on that list, which again, you made that point yesterday, and it's resonated so much with me, which is a big part of, and what we will be talking about throughout our tips, a big part of even foundation of doing flow architecture is to, document and design what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, why you're going to do it. And you made an interesting point that if you're following, let's say, modern flow best practices, don't have massive flows, subflow it, right? Make your flows more compact, calling each other. That makes every flow much simpler, less complex, easier to work with. But documenting and designing and having that picture, how everything fits together, is actually getting, as a result, more difficult. So as you're making your automation simpler, you're making your architecture to some degree more complex.
Yes. It's an interesting balancing act because it becomes more flexible too when you break things down into subflows and you have kind of meaningful units of work that can be reused, and then you can update those or version them out as needed, but you do have to keep track of what are all the subflows doing. Are they all documented? Does the documentation for each one meet the same standards that you're using for your overall documentation? And as an architect, the way I always think about it is, if I'm leaving this project that I'm working on and handing it over to either a design team or a development team or another architect, or are they going to be able to understand what I did and not have to call me every 5 minutes with a question? So, and that can be, if you have a lot of, if things are broken out modularly, that can, there could be a lot of work to do to make sure that everything is there that you need to be there.
I think this is actually a very good segue into what is the cost if you're not going to architect your flows and your automations correctly. Well, there's quite a few, aren't there? Which one would you like to expand on first?
Well, the quality and reliability is a good one. It kind of flows with what we were talking about, where if you don't architect your flows really well up front, they become really difficult to maintain over time, especially what we were just talking about with documentation. So if I design a flow and then I hand it over to somebody else who builds it, and then they hand it over to somebody else who's responsible for maintaining it, and then a business process changes 6 months later and somebody has to go in and update something and the documentation isn't really clear. If you've got a nice giant flow like the one in this graphic here, it's going to be pretty hard to trace through that. But even if you do have it broken down into subflows, if you're not clear about what each subflow is doing and what the purpose of it is, you might end up recreating the same thing that somebody else already created without even realize what you're doing.
And I think I'd like to add one additional thing to the reliability issue, which is, especially with more complex flows, if there isn't documentation, as you said, explaining why it's there, what it's supposed to achieve, how it's intended to be built, I honestly have no idea how anyone other than the person building it would be able to create any tests. I mean, record triggered flows now have tests, and I believe the flow team will continue expanding that functionality, which is great. But if someone doesn't understand what's meant to be achieved with this automation, how on earth are you going to properly test it? Unless the person who built it is going to do the testing. And I don't know about you, Tom, that doesn't strike me as particularly best practice. No. Yeah, it works. I built it. I trust it.
I built it, and I know what all the things to avoid are when I do my tests. And look at that, 100% passed. Yeah. But yeah, that's a good point. And I think when we were talking yesterday, you had made some pretty good points about troubleshooting too, and how much more difficult it can be if your flows aren't architected well.
Oh yeah, I mean, well. There's so much to unpack here. I think we've discovered it ourselves actually just this year. We've got our org is very much flow driven. We have 200 flows or 300 flows in our org, something like that. Yeah. But over time we've realized we haven't been particularly good with fault pathing, and there's so many errors kind of. we weren't handling particularly well, even from our own experience, especially if you've got a chain, and as we mentioned previously, big flows which call other flows, and data is incorrect, and then there's some data incoherence that you need to fix. It's not hours, it's days, sometimes weeks to go through and figure out block by block. It's like doing a full code review of everything that's happening, everything that's being called, and figuring out, is this it? Is that what the issue is? It could be extremely costly operation.
Yeah. And and that can take time. And then all of the things that when you look at the first three bullets, when we talk about quality, reliability, and then, if you have to redesign things, or if it's taking days to troubleshoot something that on the surface seems like it should be a pretty easy error to fix, like that all boils down to the return on investment for your automation suddenly starts going down because you're taking more time to maintain it than maybe even the value that you're getting out of building it in the first place. So that's where you have to start to be really careful and make sure that you are architecting things correctly up front.
And I think there's a lot to be said for that. Whilst there is business cost and time cost, and then as a result financial cost to the business with just lost productivity, reworks, and all that stuff, I think there's also emotional cost to the people involved. I mean, just seeing our own team, sometimes troubleshooting, correcting, reworking flows, you look at their faces, doesn't seem like a particularly joyful exercise. It can be quite soul crushing if you're hunting for that, whatever it is that you're hunting for.
Yeah, I agree. And then you get to the point where I think this is it, and then it turns out that no, it's not. You change something and you test it, and nope, doesn't make any difference. So
good news, we fixed 7 bugs, none of which are the bug we were looking for.
Right. I mean, I guess it's still a good thing, but
yeah.
But yeah, you're right. After a while, it can take a toll on you mentally too.
So let's maybe start discussing tips. Okay, that's we know why it's important, we know why it's difficult to do, and we know what the cost of it is. What can we tell the audience of how they could get started? And I think when we were discussing this yesterday, that was you just shot it. Number one, you start here. Period. This is literally first thing you should do. So tell us about that.
Yeah, the number one, I mean, before you build anything, you should make sure that you have a set of design standards in place that can be everything from, use cases for synchronous versus asynchronous automations to naming conventions, anything else. And, there's templates available. There's actually one on the Salesforce Architects website for design standards. And then make sure that you have a design process in place too, so that everybody that is on your team that's doing any kind of design work with flows or really any type of automations, but is following the same process and knows and everybody understands what the work is being done. They understand what to build, when to actually build it, and then whose responsibility it is to build what, and how and so how do you know if you are going to build something new versus reusing an existing subflow that's already been built by somebody else? And somebody still has to make those decisions, because you can get to a scenario where, for example, you've got a business process that looks really similar to another business process. Somebody built a subflow 6 months ago, but maybe there are enough nuances that it doesn't make sense to reuse it, even though on the surface it might look like it, or maybe you need to make some updates to it to handle different scenarios. But somebody should be making those decisions up front before somebody just goes in and starts building and arbitrarily decides these things.
And I think the page on the Salesforce well-architected website on I think record triggered automation forms, there are quite a few very useful standards, decision guides, helping people choose which sort of automation or which capability to choose in which scenario. Is there in your mind one scenario that, let's say, like number one thing that comes to your mind where people maybe overuse flows, where maybe flow is not the best tool? Just anything comes to mind as most common?
So high performance batch processing might be one, and you can actually see on the table here. There's this table is part of our Architect's Guide to Record Triggered Automations, and you can see that it says it's not ideal for flows. And if you read the guide, it goes into specific reasons for why. But one of the there are certain scenarios where building something in Apex actually is either more efficient, or it might even be the case where if you see some like cross-object CRUD and some of the other things where you simply can't do it in Flow. And then there's some places where Flow is actually better or equivalent to Apex when it comes to performance as well. So that's some of the things that you'll be able to find in the guide.
And I think you focus on standards and guides, but I also think, and you mentioned this yesterday as well, it's also about the process. Who gets to build what sort of thing based on their a level of expertise and things like that. I think that's also sometimes overlooked. It should that any team managing building their Salesforce orgs should have not only standards, but these standards, when they're checked, when they're reviewed, when they're consulted, should happen at specific stages in the development lifecycle. And understanding what your development lifecycle is. I mean, there is development lifecycle as a general, very abstract. You ideate, you analyze, and build, deploy, that sort of stuff. But you can always build a very specific variation just for you. Because what works, I think we both agree that how big organization works, probably the processes you guys have at Salesforce are completely different from the ones that say smaller startups or very small organizations, small non-profits might be executing, because there's no need necessarily for certain steps, or the teams aren't that big, or there are not that many dependencies between teams. So you can always design your own that works just for you. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I agree. And I'm, to your point, the process might be different based on your organization size and maybe the maturity of your team and everything. But the key is to make sure that you have a process and that everybody agrees to it, so that there isn't any confusion, and you don't have somebody just going in and willy-nilly building something, and then everybody else is going, wait, how did that get here? And go ahead.
And I just wanted to add, because I think if, especially for those in the audience who are very familiar with Agile as a set of principles, one of the principles says, people over processes. So whenever someone says, oh, you should have a process, it makes us probably look like some old school waterfall type guys. But having a process is not the same as being rigid with the process or a set of best standards, how we do things and when we do them and who's involved, is that should be more of a help as opposed to a bureaucratic set of rules. And I would argue, and we try to do it ourselves, as soon as we figure out this process doesn't work anymore, or we have outgrown it, change it. I mean, it's there to help you, not to restrict you.
Yeah, I agree. And being agile and having a good process in place to cover those are not mutually exclusive. So you definitely need both. And in a lot of ways, being agile, actually, it highlights the need for some of those guidelines even more, because it can be really easy to go off the rails if those guidelines aren't in place and you're doing agile and trying to build things quickly.
So let's go on to our second tip, which is collaborate on familiar notation. I think anytime I speak to some of our customers and other teams, it's quite interesting. Teams and people who seem to be doing the same job, but from organization to organization, even within the same organization, from team to team and from person to person, if they even do any kind of upfront design, how they do it, with which tools or methodologies they do it, whether they store it, how do they explain it, it's all different. And I think that's one of the reasons why doing flow architecture at scale at your org with your teammates is so difficult, because if everyone is we're all kind of doing the same thing, but actually doing very different things. I think we were talking the other day, you can have some very, I would say, traditionally schooled architects who are very familiar with business process modeling notation and create very complex flow charts, but then translating that into an actual flow, it's not something a lot of declarative developers will necessarily easily get. So our recommendation is to get together as a team and agree on one tool, one style guide, one methodology for documenting and designing your work, and then which is familiar and understandable to everyone. But then the key other thing which I would underscore is the collaboration. We've kind of touched upon that with the cost of not having flow architecture, reliability, lack of testing. Well, if if you're especially a more junior person and you're trying to get better at Salesforce game or kind of scale up to your architect level quickly, documenting what you plan to do, getting someone more senior, more experienced to review it, give you some pointers, point out what you might be missing, sharing with whoever will be in charge of testing it. That just saves so much time, so much energy, and helps everyone get better and avoid reworks. I'm saying that quite authoritatively, but Tom, would you disagree with that?
No, I agree 100%. And just to highlight something you just said, so I have a TOGAF certification as an enterprise architect, and I've worked alongside other people that have exactly the same certification as I have, and I've looked at some of the symbols and notation that they're using, and their diagrams and documentation look completely different than mine, and we've had to take a step back and say, wait a minute, let's agree on what we're doing here, so we're speaking the same language, and I think that's what you're getting to, and then collaborating and sharing your work, and then I would also add to make sure that everybody is sharing their work in the same place, and that you've got plans to review and update documents over time, because I've seen plenty of documentation get kind of thrown into a central repository somewhere and then never looked at again.
To die. Yeah, exactly. It's like a virtual shredder.
Right.
Just put all the stack of documents, never to look at them again.
Yes. So making sure that people know how to find the documentation and that it's actually useful too is another big thing.
Now, a small segue on that point, but your team has produced that kit of parts, Salesforce diagrams, an official notation for how you propose and recommend people design and document and think about their system landscapes and architecture. Now, we have found at Elements that even though it's not officially part of that paradigm, but combining your paradigm with flow iconography makes for a very good, instantly recognizable design tool, actually. Yeah. And the image you see there is actually from our own flow.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, it's a great way to, and like you said, even though that iconography for flow isn't specifically within our kit of parts because it's at a little bit lower level, but yeah, you can use the same format to build out and like a really nice process flow diagram, and yeah, that looks great.
So you talked a lot yesterday when we had a planning session about having and establishing a measurable output or success criteria for your automation. Talk us through it. Well, and I think you had some interesting examples from your work that you could share.
Yeah. So I can actually tell you, I have a small nonprofit that some friends and I run as a volunteer effort on, and we had built some automations to help automate our business. So, this is something that all of us have full-time jobs. None of us are 100% dedicated to running this organization, but it provides a pretty valuable service because we provide transportation for homeless animals. And we went from having a very small operation where we were doing this a couple times a year, and there were 4 of us, we could handle it on ourselves on the weekends, all the way up to having a pretty big explosion in the number of transports we were doing because we got an endorsement from a pretty well-known celebrity in the US. And the only way we were able to continue to operate the way that we do today, as just completely volunteer effort, none of us make a salary or anything, was we had to build automations that we knew were going to save the amount of time that we were spending. So before we built our automations, we were spending, we had gone from spending a few hours a week to spending, all 4 of us spending easily 10 to 20 hours per week in addition to our full-time jobs. And with our automations, we've been able to reduce that back down to a handful of hours, and which keeps our organization running well. And this is a good point of how often do we expect the automation to be used, and what's the volume of records that we're going to be using with it, and then do we know what the business benefits are going to be before? So it would not have been worth our time to build these automations if we didn't know that they were going to provide some type of value for us, which they clearly did from a business perspective. But when we think about building and testing flows, if this comes back to the architect versus builder part that we talked about earlier, if you're a builder, you're kind of focused on, okay, if I build this flow and I run it and test it, does it actually work and not give any errors? And that's great, but which obviously you need to do. But as an architect, you also need to take a step back and say, okay, but also what is the business value of building the automation in the first place, and how are we going to measure it? And do we have any KPIs that we can measure against, for example?
There's an additional point I want to make, but it actually probably will make more sense in context of tip number 7. So I'm going to save it for now. Another tip, which Tom kind of alluded to in tip number 2, centralize your designs. And when this is an important one. When I, at least, I don't want to put words in Tom's mouth, but when I think about centralization of your design, I don't actually mean have a Google Drive or OneDrive and just put 200, 500, 700 different documents in there. Nah, that's not going to work. That's the shredder, the virtual shredder, where things go to die. The best way to actually, when I talk about centralizing your designs, I mean make them reference each other. Make it so that when you go review your design documentation, when you design certain documentation, you don't do it in limbo. You don't do it from a blank sheet of paper. I think unless you're starting with a completely new org, and I don't think most people watching this are in this position right now, whatever you're building, whatever automation or flow specifically you're planning to build, it doesn't just exist on its own. It exists as part of the general Salesforce metadata tapestry, but even more specifically, it also resides within a specific order of execution, which is one of those very, order of execution is probably one of the hardest things to really appreciate and work with in Salesforce automation landscape. But if you put in the effort to, and we have done a similar thing with our opportunities and cases, that we know what our order of execution is, and when we plan to add another element, we first go, where does it fit? Does it fit at all? Is there a place left in there to do it? If you can start asking yourselves these sort of questions, if you build up your designs, documentation, where you can start having that sort of going through with your thinking, going, where does it fit? If it fits at all, I would argue you're doing at that point like proper red or orange belt flow architecture. Or am I not generous enough, Tom?
No, I agree, and I think I saw somebody in the chat mention standardization, which I know we've talked about in one of the earlier tips, but you're right. So making sure that that cross-reference part is huge, so that you understand how things actually fit together, and I'm not digging for the document that has the next part of this process somewhere in just a shared drive somewhere, and being able to follow something end to end as a designer, really for no matter what role you are, is essential to making sure that your system is, number one, is healthy in general, and that it's well designed, but that as things evolve and over time, which they always do, processes change, that it's easy to maintain. So
let's go on to, I think, your other favorite topic. We mentioned, actually, for historical reasons, actually you made that point, for historical reasons, flow architecture hasn't really been anyone's direct responsibility. So it's probably no surprise that tip number 5 is make it someone's responsibility, but there's more nuance to it than that. Talk us through it, Tom.
Yeah, there is. So, and I think that the second bullet point really, drives that, is that everybody is equally responsible for developing a kind of a culture of good architecture and good design throughout your organization. And maybe it's the platform owner's ultimate responsibility to make sure that things are well designed or well documented, and that the documentation is available, and that everybody understands what the system is supposed to be doing. But there are a bunch of other roles that are contributing to that overall design, and everybody has a responsibility. So as an architect, a lot of times we take a step back and think about like, well, maybe I don't need to know how to design the individual components within a flow, but I just need to know what the flow is doing and how it fits. But that's still part of the responsibility. And then the next person will go a little bit level deeper, and they'll start looking at how the components work together. And is this the optimal way to have everything laid out within this flow? And is this the right way for is this the right data we should be retrieving from the system and saving it? That's also an equal responsibility. And then even before that, you've got the business analysts that are analyzing the underlying process that you're trying to automate in the first place. So.
And I will add one additional thing. To your point, this needs to, yes, platform owners and architects, they need to lead the way, but this needs to be a culture of responsibility across the entire team. And it's not just kind of come by, I wouldn't be nice. There's another very important reason, which is documentation. I'm not sure to totally agree, but the thing about design documentation, or any documentation for that matter, it's that it's very, your trust in it is very binary. You either trust your design documentation or you don't trust it. There isn't, I trusted 90%.
Yeah.
So if you invest time, and it's especially a warning to everyone who is willing to really give flow architecture a chance, as we recommend you do. The worst thing that could happen is you invest time and energy with your team to do it. You've spent hours, designing, and it feels like hours, but it's actually what you're doing is you're saving hours you would spend otherwise on reworks, troubleshooting, unnecessary communication calls, all of that stuff.
Yeah.
And then it takes one person to just go ahead, change stuff, not really update, let's say, existing designs. And you lose trust not only in one of those designs, you probably lose trust in all of them.
Yes.
And do you start from scratch? Do you continue? It's a very demotivating moment when it happens, unless there is a culture and a process to really, let's go through the process. Let's make sure we always adhere to these best principles.
That is a really good, I like your trust is binary comment too, because if somebody gave me a document and said, I'm pretty sure this is mostly accurate, I would have zero confidence in anything in that document. And then any documents that are related to it, right? It would have a cascading effect. So you're exactly right.
I would make, I'm not, no, we're kind of running out of time, so I'll speed it up slightly. My tip number 6 would be, make sure all of you listening that you choose tools that allow you to keep revisiting your designs. What I mean by that is, and to be honest, even Google Slides to a certain degree allow you to do that. It's about versioning. It's about making sure that if you design your flows, that you can then reuse that documentation, because it isn't particularly alluring if you have to redocument your flows, especially existing flows, all the time from scratch. But if you have the capacity to design it once, okay, that's what it was before. Let's reuse that, or maybe even copy it, and then let's continue working on that. So you don't always start from a blank canvas. That would be a very good productivity tip. And the other thing is diagrams. My colleague from work put it brilliantly the other day. Diagram should not just be a picture. Yeah. I cannot underscore this enough. Diagram should not just be a picture. If it's a picture, it hangs on the wall or in your Google Drive, and that's about it. If you make it a collaborative document, if you make it something from which you can drive changes, plan changes, then it becomes a living document. It's not just documentation. That's part of your design process. Tom, would you agree with me on that?
Yeah, your diagram really, the way I think of it is your diagram should tell a story. So it is more than just a picture. It's explaining whatever it is, depending on your diagram level or who your audience is, but it's explaining a concept to somebody that will give them some clarity about what it is that you're trying to build, to automate, to the approach that you're trying to take about whatever it is. But yeah, I agree 100%.
And finally, tip number 7, we've arrived at the most important one. And I was so glad when you said it yesterday. Understand the user journey and build automations around it. Tell us what you had in mind when you said that.
And this kind of goes back to some of the things we talked about a little earlier, where if you're thinking individual components within a flow of, should I be using, do I need to make sure I have a fault path here? Or should I use the asynchronous versus synchronous path? For how to like physically build your flow, that's one thing. But as an architect, if you really want to design a good flow, the thing is to take a step back and think about the user journey. So why would I build something that is asynchronous? So, for example, does the user that's ultimately going to be executing this flow really need to be sitting there and waiting for it to return some type of response? Or am I just handing something off to an external system that's going to go and process something on its own, and then the user can go and do another task? Or maybe the user does need to be waiting for the system to give a response before they can continue on, because they need to know they need that result for whatever the next step is that they need to do, in which case you are going to use the synchronous architecture. But really thinking about that user journey and that user experience around your automations before you start designing and building them.
And I said when you were talking about tip number 3, measuring your outcomes, that I'm going to put something in my pocket and take it out around tip number 7. I think it's worth giving a shout out to the Shield team, and I think there's value in investing in event log monitoring in your org, because what we've discovered once we did that is, yes, you build flow and you think you're helping your end users. But is it actually being used? They expect, if your sales team were using this flow to click that button and initiate that screen flow, the allocation of licenses will be that much easier. Are they actually doing it? Have you put it in a place in a way that is instantly available, intuitive to them? And if you're not seeing the adoption, the level of utilization that you expect, you've missed something about that user journey. And it's not possible, in my view, in my experience, to get that user journey right the first time, like fully. But if you get into the habit of talk with your end users, understand, design that user journey, build around it, measure, to your point, and keep iterating until you get to the level of utilization adoption that where it actually makes sense, where the return on investment actually starts returning that investment. That's how you should do it.
Agreed. And one of the interesting things about user adoption is we think, well, as an architect, is that really our responsibility? And the truth is it is, because if your users don't want to adopt your system, you're going to end up either with shadow IT because they're not using your system and they're using spreadsheets and things to do their work, or you're going to have users that try to hurry up and get through your using the system as fast as they can because they don't want to use it. And then you end up with data quality issues because they're making mistakes when they're entering things because they just want to get out of the system. So not having happy end users leading to lower adoption can cascade into a bunch of other issues as well.
Absolutely. And that shadow IT comment, yes, I was startled over the years how many organizations we've come across where this is happening, where they're even running their own small Salesforce org or Trailhead orgs on the side, separate from the actual org. It can be scary.
Oh, fun times. Yeah.
Right. I think that's our 7 tips. For all those watching, if you scan this QR code, you can get a free ebook which covers a lot of the same topics we've discussed today with Tom, with some practical, expanding on some of those practical tips. But also I want to make sure everyone bookmarks and remembers to go to Salesforce well-architected website and the decision guides, because there's a ton of very useful tips on what types of automation, but even UI, whether to use Lightning, whether to use like web components and dynamic forms, when to use them and not to use them. There's just a ton of useful stuff which will make your flow architecture and journey that 10,000 times easier.
Awesome.
Thank you. Well, I guess, Tom, thank you so much. And Ben is back.
Hey
guys.
How did we do, Ben?
Oh, fantastic. 11 out of 10. No, it was great chat. A lot to cover. So much good stuff in there. So thank you, guys. I'm sure you've been seeing a few of the comments, but there's a lot of chat in here. A lot of people offering help to others. So thank you for that. Thank you for the interaction with the audience and offering helpful links and things like that. So we'll go into a Q&A now. I can see some questions that have come through. If you've got any more, feel free to drop them in the comments, and we'll see how many we can get around to. It's funny that you mentioned well architected there, because I did have a comment, I can't find it now, asking if there's going to be any more flow architecture content on well architected, Tom, because someone enjoyed it so much.
Oh, awesome. So we are, so more to come on that. So we're in the process of figuring out what changes we need to make or additions we need to make to the framework, and hoping to have some more updates on that soon.
Great, thanks, Tom. There was another question, just a nice easy one for me. Will this be recorded? Yes, it will. It'll be on YouTube, our YouTube channel afterwards. So you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and get updates from there. There was a lot of questions. A lot of the topic was about, diagramming, documenting, being on the same page. What tools would you recommend for diagramming flows?
So we've got our Salesforce diagram framework, but which you can use it in Lucidchart, but also Elements, I think, is a great tool for diagramming flows. And I think the nice thing, and Xavier, I'll let you talk a little more about this, but you can show your flows within the context of other documentation that you have about your org and its metadata within Elements.
So I'm obviously very biased in the answer I'm going to give, but Elements is the tool I would choose, mostly because I'm building it. But in all honesty, there's one specific element that in our tool you can leverage while you're building your. And I don't like to call it even documentation. I prefer to call it designs, because that feels more actionable and then it's more active. Documentation has a very bad rap. It feels like afterthought a lot of the time. But one of the things you can do with our tool is not only draw the diagrams, but actually associate the diagrams with the metadata and make it available on demand in context of like Salesforce setup. So, that's also the other thing, which is rather than someone having to go to a particular drive somewhere, and let's hope they do, to find a documentation, they go to work on a particular flow. Hey, guess what? The all design documentation and ability to jump into that design diagram and work on that is available straight from setup and from Salesforce generally, exactly where people work. So I think that's probably one of the more powerful features, especially for architects and developers.
Great, thanks, guys. You can kill two birds with one stone by checking out the Elements ebook that was presented a minute ago. So the link is in the comments, the definitive guide to designing well architected flows. And at the same time, you can check out Elements' website as well. So this question was bound to come up, but interested to get your thoughts on it. Let me just find it. So it's from Ryan. One before save and one after save record trigger flow per object, or are we doing multiple record trigger flows with specific entry criteria? What's the latest on that?
Yes, I can go. So the interesting thing is, if I know a lot of Salesforce documentation is out there that still talks about one automation per object. We are working on getting that all updated, because that's actually not the recommended best practice anymore. And if you look in well architected, we specifically don't say one automation per object, because there are so many tools available, such as the different types of flows and when they execute. There's tools like Flow Orchestrator, but then you can set priorities for record triggered automations. You can use invocable Apex if you want to use Flow and Apex together, for example. And the idea is one automation per object actually did make sense years ago, when we didn't have control over the order of execution and the way that things actually, the way that your automations would execute. We've added more and more of those controls into the platform. So now it is use the right automations at the right time and make sure that you know how to orchestrate them properly is the best way. And before save versus after save, it's going to depend on what it is that you're specifically trying to do. But the point is that you don't have to try to cram everything into one giant automation anymore.
Which coming back to, I think, the point we made at the very beginning, Tom, now that it's so flexible to create the type of automation for the use case that you have, and thinking about the orchestration between all of them, flow architecture, automation architecture becomes that much more important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Great, thanks a lot. Good to get that one ticked off. There's an interesting one here from Matt. When building your design documentation, how do you balance level of detail so you give the builders enough detail to build it and maintain it without getting to the point where you might as well build the flow yourself?
Yeah, I'll give a quick plug for the Salesforce Architects website, but we have in our diagramming framework, there's a page that specifically is how to build Salesforce diagrams, and we have have some information about how to break diagrams into different levels based on who the audience is and what you're trying to convey. So we have different styles and different levels, and one style is specifically for a technical audience, one is more for a business audience, and then the levels get more granular as you go down. So you may have to you may have to look at creating different versions of your documentation for different audiences, but they are going to be more effective if you do that.
And I would add to that, and if we focus, let's say, for instance, on flow or automation diagrams specifically, it depends really. There's no one golden rule. I would say create the skeleton. So if your flow is going to have an update and a decision and a loop, these elements, this business logic should be represented in your design documentation. And whether through sticky notes, descriptions, some basic attributes on those boxes, if you add what is the general attribute that you're trying to find or you're trying to process, that should be enough. Because I agree, if you get to a point where you design your flow, so let's say specifically to such detail that actually every field down to its actual API name is all captured like that, yeah, maybe it feels a bit too time consuming. But if you make it again, if you keep the skeleton and just a bit of muscle to it, so that probably is the best balance to make it work and make it fun.
Great, thanks a lot. And just a quick comment from Sarah Hope. So I think this is referring to what you were talking about, Xavier, about associating the design diagram with the metadata in setup, and that's an Elements feature, right?
Yes. So our tool is a pretty broad platform for org management. It's a Salesforce change intelligence platform. So we have a diagramming capability. That's on one side. We can scan your Salesforce orgs, your production, your sandboxes to create metadata dictionaries. So we have a complete list of all your metadata, all the types. We also have your change records, your user stories, requirements, these sort of things. And all three of those types of assets can relate to each other. So when you create a diagram, you can, by literally copy pasting or even doing a quick search very soon, you can just go, okay, I have a diagram representing this flow, or I have an order of execution, and this box represents opportunity object, and this box represents this flow, and you can create those linkages. And then on top of that, if you want to create, okay, now that we have designed this, we need to do this, we need to do that. So I'm going to create one ticket, I'm going to create another ticket, and these tickets then are also linked to specific parts of the diagram, specific metadata in the metadata dictionary. All of that is self-referencing, living, fundamentally design assets.
Great, thanks so much. Let's see, I did have a question here. A few compliments of well architected coming in.
Oh,
so
great
job, Tom, and check out well architected. I think we've got a link somewhere in the chat, but feel free to type into Google and check out this great official Salesforce resource.
Thank you.
So I'll just wait and see if there's any more questions coming in that we can just tackle right at the end here. But one from me. So if there's so much information in here, if you're not using flow architecture at all, Where would you recommend is the best place for someone to start tomorrow if they want to start looking into flow architecture for their org? I'll let go for it, Tom.
I'm going to say probably what Tom was going to say. Probably well architected is your number one stop on that journey.
Yeah, well architected, and then our record triggered automation decision guide is a really good one as well. And we've actually got a couple other decision guides on the Salesforce Architects website that touch on flow and different elements of it, but record triggered automation goes into it pretty heavily.
Great. And for you, Xavier, the answer is probably going to be elements.cloud.
Well, surprisingly, no. I think if we're talking about where do we start, and if we're not doing anything, that everything we've discussed sounds exciting. Where do I start? I think number one, I would say definitely well architected, so you understand that there are. And for people who haven't seen those, these guides are pretty detailed and pretty long. It's not necessarily it's not war and peace, but at the same time, it's not light reading. There's a lot of stuff in there to familiarize yourself with. And I don't think you can actually necessarily. Tom maybe can, but it's not. It's so much information in there that you cannot memorize it all. So that's why you need to keep coming back to it. I would also say it might be advisable if we're talking about setting up your processes and standards. Even on Trailhead, doing a Trailhead course in Universal Process Notation for business analysts, because that teaches you how to design using very simple notation, instantly understandable to all audiences, your business processes. Because then you can get to what was, I don't remember, that was tip number, that was tip number one. So that all checks out. Design your process and figure out how we're going to work, when we're going to call on these different decision guides, what other standards we might want to follow. Elements would be yes. Then step 3, if you want to design your business processes and start documenting, designing your flows and making them available on demand in Salesforce. Yes, absolutely. I would welcome everyone to try out Elements. But in this order is actually step number 3. First, well architected, UPN course on Trailhead in UPN, and then Elements was going to welcome all of you.
All right, that makes sense too, because before you're getting ready to document everything, you need to do some of that up front and get that upfront knowledge. So yeah.
Great. That's the path to success. Well, thank you so much, guys, for your time. This has been fantastic. So many great resources in here. As I mentioned previously, this recording will be on YouTube afterwards. So if you'd like to recap with anything, then you can check it out there. But thank you so much for joining us, everyone in the audience. We had, I think, 1,500 people register for this LinkedIn Live. So it just shows you how popular this topic is. So thank you, Xavier. Tom, any last words at all?
Thanks for having us, and thank you to everybody for the great dialogue and questions. And this was great.
Yeah, likewise. I had a blast. It was amazing. Thank you so much for hosting us.
Great, cool. Thanks a lot, guys. See everyone soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.